Hi all, and welcome to Chess News number 44. It is that time of the year again. The Tata Steel chess tournament in Wijk is going on, and I want to take a look at a game that was played yesterday on Sunday the 12th of January between Aronian and Caruana. According to the commentaries on the websites, it was a great technical win for Aronian, so I was curious to see what we could learn from it. So here we go. Aronian opened with Knight f3, Caruana played Knight f6. We now enter some sort of an English setup with the c4, and Caruana plays the symmetrical English. But after Knight c3 in d5, here comes already the first imbalance. We see an exchange in the center, and after d4 and the subsequent exchange on c3 and g6, the game has entered Grunfeld-like waters. Now here e4 is the main line, we could say, but Aronian instead plays quite a rare line with bishop f4. After bishop g7, he now bolsters his center with e3, and both sides continue to develop quite naturally. Caruana castles, White plays bishop d3, and now comes a move that I personally don't like so much. Black now plays knight d7. I don't like this move because I think the knight belongs on c6 in such structures, where it puts pressure on White's central pawn on d4, but also, very importantly, does not obstruct his bishop on c8. Now, to say that this move is already an inaccuracy or a mistake would be too harsh, but like I say, I don't really like this move, and we will see the consequences of this move a little bit later on. So White now continues with castles, and here comes queen a5, putting pressure on White's weak and for the moment undefended pawn on c3. White now protects that with queen c2, also connects his rook, and we could say that for the moment White has finished his development, or he has finished the opening. He has put some pawns in the center, he has developed his minor pieces towards the center, he has brought his king into safety by castling, he has given his queen a function, and he has connected the rooks. So basically these are the 5 rules that you should follow in order to complete your opening. Now Black, on the other hand, is not quite there yet. And he now plays a move that I also don't like too much. He now exchanges c takes d4. Now this move resolves White's weakness on c3, because the pawn on c3 is no longer there and just was replacing the one on d4. But it also opens up the c-file for White, which after knight d7 can be exploited easier than when the knight would have been blocking the c-file on c6, right? White's queen now has entry into c7 a little bit later on. And also, what I would like to point out to you on several occasions in this game is that very often, and also on this high grandmaster level, rules of thumb normally apply. And one of these rules of thumb is that to trade is a mistake, or to give up the tension, if you like, is a mistake. And I believe that in this case that was also a minor inaccuracy. In this case there is tension between the pawn on c5 and the pawn on d4, and by resolving the tension, Black just lets White get rid of his weakness on c3 and also opens up the c-file for him. So instead, I think a better try would have been knight b6, just to open up the diagonal towards h3 for his light squared bishop, but also to threaten knight d5, hitting the bishop on f4, and also that aforementioned weakness on c3, which now is still on the board. Of course, in this situation, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for white to go bishop c7 and pin the knight to the queen, because the bishop from c7 does not do so much damage here as the queen will later on in the game. Play could continue. Bishop e6, and black is just already about to kick away that nasty white bishop. Queen b2, for instance. And now, after rook c8, a bishop takes b6 and a b6, and black is even slightly more comfortable with his two bishops. So, instead of that, after knight b6, I think it's better for white to play bishop e4 to defend against the double attack with knight d5, and only now it would make sense for black to trade when there's something concrete to be gained, and this concreteness is now the move knight d5. It's funny, knight d5 was not possible before because there was a black pawn on c5, but now by exchanging on d4 he opens up the fifth rank so that the black queen can now protect the knight jump to d5. Obviously bishop takes d5 and queen takes d5 is really not a problem for black. Yes, white has a strong center, but black has two bishops and also the majority on the queen side as compensation. So I guess that in this case white would have to go bishop g3, but after b6 black seems to be solving his opening problems rather smoothly. So back to the game, where on the 11th move white played queen c2 and black answered with the somewhat inaccurate c takes d4. So obviously Aronian recaptures c takes d4, and now it's very important, I think, for black to act, because white is already threatening to seriously increase the pressure on the queen side with such moves as rook a to b1, rook f to c1, and who knows, if the knight goes to b6, then also queen c7. So Caruana now plays e5 and counters in the center. So we have been talking about maintaining the tension, right? And Aronian now shows that he knows how to keep the tension. A move that would be played maybe by many amateur players would be to react to black's pawn move and exchange in the center with d takes e5. But in exchanging, again in releasing the tension, you actually lure or allow your opponent's pieces to come forward. So the knight moves forward. And again, if you would exchange on e5, black's bishop would come forward. And again, if you exchange, black's queen, well, would not come forward, but would even be centralized. And in this particular situation, I think black has only one problem, but it's a problem that can be solved. And it's the weakness on b7 and the fact that his bishop from c8 hasn't moved yet. So if white is still suggesting that he has some sort of an advantage, then he can either try bishop e4 or rook ab1. Now let's take a look at both moves. But obviously after rook ab1, black simply plays b6 and is absolutely fine. And if he goes for bishop e4, then, well, I suppose black could try the counterattack on the bishop on e4 with rook e8, and then another counterattack after bishop f3, namely bishop f5, and again he has solved all his problems. So after e5, Aronian wisely does not go for the massive exchange on e5, but just simply drops back his bishop to g3, thereby maintaining the tension in the center. And now he gives Caruana the opportunity to exchange in the center, thereby luring his knight, the white knight, forward. So here goes Caruana. So if your opponent trades, you often get to move your pieces forward, right? So doesn't Caruana understand this? I mean, Aronian has just shown him that with bishop g3 you can maintain the tension. And now he's passing the ball, he's putting it back in Caruana's corner, and he's saying, so show me, can you also maintain the tension? And now all of a sudden Caruana is giving up the tension. Doesn't he know chess? Yes, of course he knows chess, but let's go back one move. And if you study the position very carefully, it seems, or it dawns on you that in this particular position it's actually quite difficult to see how black on his turn could maintain the tension. The knight has to protect e5 because it's attacked 3 times by white pieces, and therefore it cannot really move. But the knight wants to move because it wants to free up the bishop from c8, right? Now, of course, if the knight had been on c6, the bishop could move already. It could go, for instance, to g4, where it would attack the white knight, which is participating in the fight for the e5 square. But the knight is not on c6, the knight is on d7. So in this particular case, it's actually quite difficult for Caruana to maintain the tension. And since he wants to, or should I say needs to, move his knight sooner or later, he is sort of forced to give up the tension. So here goes Caruana. E takes d4, but obviously this gives Aronian the opportunity to recapture with his knight, and now he has a centralized knight. And apart from that, all of his pieces, apart maybe from his rooks, which can be moved to the center of ice rather quickly, are in good or at least decent positions, whereas black's pieces, most notably the bishop on c8 and the knight on d7, are still not very well placed. So of course Caruana tries to solve his opening problems and now moves the knight forward. Knight b6. But here comes a very nice multi-purpose move, already mentioned earlier. Queen c7. So here we see the consequence of the premature trade on d4 on move 11, which opened up the c file for white. It is now actually quite difficult for black to develop his queen side. Obviously, from c7, the white queen is putting pressure on the b7 pawn. It is also very nastily pinning the knight against the queen on a5, but it also takes away the d8 square from black's rook, thereby threatening the immediate bishop d6. So in this position, white already has a nasty initiative. So to illustrate the threat of a bishop d6, let's enter a null move and suppose it is white's turn to move, which is of course illegal, but let's just imagine black would not move and he would hand over the move to white once more. Then white could play bishop d6, and now it would not make sense to play rook e8 because then the other bishop comes in, bishop b5, and well, white is almost winning already. Bishop d4 with the counter attack against the rook on a1 doesn't really help, because after bishop takes e8 and bishop takes a1, which tries to maintain the material balance, it turns out that white is simply mating black with queen takes f7, king h8 and queen f8. So if after this threat of bishop d6 rook e8 doesn't work, then in this case he would have to go bishop takes d4, immediately countering against the rook on a1, but also eliminating the defender of a possible bishop d5, namely the knight on d4, right, which is not here anymore to support bishop b5. Then play could continue e takes d4, and obviously black has surrendered his dark squared bishop. White still has his dark squared bishop. He's still hitting the rook on f8, and black's king is feeling very, very insecure without the defense of his dark squared bishop. So yeah, that would really be a very nasty and strong threat for white. So back to the game after queen c7, where Caruana felt forced to give up his dark squared bishop in order to meet this threat of bishop d6. Now, of course, this is not something you like to do as black in this position, right? I mean, you put your beautiful Grunfeld bishop on g7 not just to trade it and make your king feel drafty, right? You're not being a very good servant of the king if you give up your life in that way. So Aronian obviously recaptures, and yeah, black's position is difficult to play in this moment, and maybe is lost in a higher sense. I don't really know. But in order to complete his development, black now decides to sack a pawn with bishop f5. Now there was another possibility to develop this bishop, namely bishop e6, which does, and I think that's very important, which does keep one more minor piece on the board. And here's another rule of thumb. Actually, this bishop e6 could have been more solid, since you should not trade pieces when down material. So it is remarkable how often simple chess laws and rules of thumb can be applied even on the highest level. So if we go down that line a little bit longer, play could have continued. Queen takes b7, but now rook a d8, putting pressure on white's weakness on d4, and well, white will protect that weakness, but after f6 this defender is chased away again, and after bishop f4, rook f7, black is having firm control of d5, and he is staving off the worst. Yeah, it should be noted here, I think, that, let me see, that rook d4 is not really a very good try, because then bishop h6 really puts the screws on black's king side and starts making use of the weaknesses on the dark squares. The threat is, of course, queen g7 mate, and if you try to defend that with, let's say, rook d7, yeah, I think I'll go, let's enter that, let's put that on the board. I think I'll just go back here, and I'm defending my bishop on d3, and I'm guessing that I still have a very nice initiative now against this queen side. Excuse me, king side. Yeah. Let me continue that line a little bit more now that I see it. Obviously, you want to keep f6 protected, yeah, but you also don't want to lose your rook from f8. So what happens if you move it to f7? Well, for one thing, I'm not very happy with the fact that now the king is in a very dangerous situation. I have the feeling that if we just start bringing the rooks, I don't know, rook ae1 or rook fe1, that we're putting very, very serious pressure on black's position here. This doesn't feel right at all. This looks very good for white. Okay, so having said that, let's go back to the game. Yeah, let's keep our focus a little bit. After e takes d4, as mentioned, black tried bishop f5 instead of bishop e6, which I think would have been a little bit more testing. So Bishop takes f5 was played by Aronian. I think white is happy to trade because what's wrong for his opponent is right for him, right? When up material, you should trade pieces. Also, his remaining bishop, the one from the dark squares, is clearly stronger than black's knight, which will really never find a stable square. This is, by the way, one of the advantages of the bishop pair, the ability to trade one of them, often at will, and have another one left. So, black recaptures the bishop, and now after queen takes b7, let's take stock, right? Black has survived, quote unquote, the opening, but white has emerged with an extra pawn and the better minor piece. Also, black's king position is a bit drafty. The technical phase, however, is going to be extremely difficult because white's extra pawn can be blockaded on a light square, a square that his bishop does not control. For this reason, white will be looking to exchange advantages into other, more realizable advantages. And the way Aronian tries to do this is very instructive. Basically, what he's aiming for several moves later is that he will exchange his d-pawn for black's a-pawn, and then he will be left over with a far or outside passed pawn, which is more difficult for black's knight to stop than the pawn in the center on the d-file. Okay, so Caruana goes rook fd8, the fight against the d4 pawn sets in. Of course, black would have preferred to keep the f-rook at home with regards to the move f7, f6, but moving the a-rook to d8 would hang the a-pawn immediately, so that's not possible. White plays rook fd1, rook d7 was played, hitting the queen. The queen goes to a6. She does not really retreat, but keeps bugging the black queen side. Black now plays queen e4, threatening to win the pawn on d4. White now protects it with bishop e5, and black now prepares to chase away that defender on e5, preparing f7, f6. Okay, white goes h3, securing his king, and black now indeed plays f7, f6. Now I'm pretty sure it's undoubtedly the most toughest to kick the bishop away from its strong position in the center, from where it is performing several functions, right? Protecting the pawn on d4, but also eyeing the black king. But we should also note that one never makes such a move with great pleasure, because moving the f-pawn not only weakens the notorious a2 to g8 diagonal, but, and in this case more importantly, it also severely weakens the 7th rank, indicated in yellow here. And it is exactly this factor that will do black in at the very end of the game. So normally, always, if your opponent is moving his f-pawn, be it 1 square or 2 square, try and make use of that, take advantage of that, by either attacking on the diagonal or later to enter on the 2nd rank, because it will be all the more drafty, especially in black's case here. He has no more protection from the side for his king position on the 7th rank. Okay, obviously the white bishop is now en prise and Aronian retreats it to g3. Now, black cannot immediately take the pawn on d4 because the pawn on a7 is still hanging, so he prepares to take on d4, renews the threat against d4 by playing rook f to f7, defending a7 from the side, and now rook d7 takes d4 is a threat. But white counterattacks, tickling the queen a little bit there. The queen goes to f5, and it's time for white now to activate his last inactive piece. He plays rook a c1, a very healthy move, already looking at black's weakened 8th rank here. Well, a little bit of prophylaxis here from Aronian. King g7, already sidestepping any possible future checks on the 8th rank. And white does something similar. He plays king h2, thereby also protecting the bishop on g3, which was loose. We all know what John Nunn says, right? Loose pieces drop off, so it's important to keep everything protected. And indeed, in this position, everything is protected. In both camps, by the way, in both white and black camp. Well, rook fe7, this rook could be improved a little bit, so why not? Let's put it on the open file. But white does the same. Rook c5, improving his general square control, and also starting the fight for d5, which currently is still very much in the hands of black. And if d5 is in the hands of black, you will never be able to use your free pawn. And we should also note, of course, that currently the a7 pawn is also still very well protected. So it will take white a lot of effort and a lot of tiny, small, little improvements to actually force some water out of this stone. Okay, it was possible now, for instance, to move the queen, but then already d5 is possible and white starts moving his trump. So instead Caruana plays knight d5, maintaining the blockade on d5. White now plays queen a5, attacking a pinned piece and thereby fixing the black pieces. And I think black now commits an inaccuracy. He plays queen e6. He wants to go out of the pin, but he had a much better move. Let's take a look at that first. He could have played rook e2. Now this rook was not really necessary to protect a7 or d5, so the rule of economy of forces tells us that we could use it for something else, right? And by putting it on the 2nd rank, black had some hopes for counterplay, and well, that was to be preferred, or should I say is always to be preferred. Play could continue rook e1. White would like to exchange that pesky rook, because then black would be left with passive blockading pieces only, but the pesky rook moves away to b2 and things are still not so clear. This rook is very active and we don't really like it there on the 2nd rank. But instead of that, after queen a5, Caruana played queen e6, giving white the opportunity to improve his least active piece. White now plays rook e1, a very nice move, solidifying his advantage. And because the queen is in front of the battery together with the rook in the e-file, this move is of course possible. I see now, by the way, that is a silly remark, because the rook on e1 is 2 times protected also by the queen from a5, so that's an irrelevant remark. But nonetheless, it enables white to improve his rook, which was first behind the d-pawn, so only looking at his d-pawn and not doing any active duty. But now it will join the fray on the completely open e-file. So the queen has to retreat, it goes to f7, and now instead of exchanging, according to the rule of thumb, right, that it is good to exchange when you're up material, with rook e7, white now plays the very beautiful rook e4. Now white's advantage is getting more and more serious. But why not exchanging? Well, in this particular case it would seem that keeping the tension, the other rule, is stronger because it still keeps the option to exchange at a later time, but also it discourages black from exchanging himself on e4, since then white would have a strong connected pawn duo in the center, immediately breaking the blockade on d5, right? So also obviously f7, f6 to attack the rook is never an option, since that would weaken the dark squares too much. Okay, so that's what I like in particular about this rook e4 move. It puts the rook on a square where it is protected, where it works together with the f3 pawn, and thereby also cuts down on black's activity of the rook on e7. But black now plays knight e3, like a bolt from the blue. Black is fighting back. He now threatens the nasty knight f1 check, winning the bishop and also the game. Okay, now I think the best reaction for Aronian here would have been to play queen e1, which would have led to favorable exchanges. Of course, this protects the f1 square, but also enhances the pressure down the e-file. Play could have continued with knight f5, for instance, and here it would have been possible for white to push his trump card, and after these exchanges white would be seriously better and would have good winning chances. But after knight e3, Aronian slipped up a little bit. He played the rather passive bishop f2 here. So, okay, well, he passes up on the opportunity. Not too much is lost, must be said. But of course the bishop is better on g3 than it is on f2. And it would have been nice for white to just put more pressure on the e-file there. Well, the knight now returns to f5. And now Aronian does not slip up a little bit, but he actually makes quite a serious mistake now, which could have cost him almost all of his advantage. Now this is the 32nd move, and I guess we were approaching, or they were approaching, time trouble, which could explain a little bit why this move was not the best of the game. But let's cut to the chase. He played queen d2. Now I must admit, it's very, very difficult to see. But at this particular moment in time, a lot of tactical factors determine the outcome of the current position. Caruana now passes up the opportunity, but he could have played the forcing rook takes e4, which is something you don't want to do, so maybe he had already excluded that from his mind. But in this particular case, with the queen lined up, with the queen lined up here with the rook, it would have been a good exchange, because of course white is forced to recapture, and now the fantastic move queen e7, an incredibly nasty move, and very easy to understand that both players missed this nice shot. The thing is that black is threatening both queen takes c5, using the pin along the d-file, but also knight takes d4, eliminating the defender of the rook on c5. And in this case, white has to sort of bail out with queen c2, but after knight d4, he has lost the pride of his position. And I very, very seriously doubt if Aronian would still have been able to win this position. Maybe he still has, I don't know, a little bit of advantage because of his, I don't know, maybe his bishop is still a little bit better than the knight. But yeah, like I say, I'm having doubts. I think it's much more drawn position then it is a position with serious winning chances for white. Let's not forget that material is even. Black has only 2 pawn islands, white has 3 pawn islands, so I think the game is pretty much in the balance. So let's take a look at that once more. White played queen d2, and black could have used the opportunity to play rook takes e4, and after f takes e4 play queen e7 with 2 threats, namely queen takes c5, using the pin in the d file, and the d pawn. The pinned pawn is not a good defender in this case of the rook on c5, but also the threat of knight takes d4, eliminating the defender of the rook on c5. And if that's not enough, of course, black is also hitting the e pawn. Yeah, forgot to mention that. I mean, so that's 3 points in one move, right? 3 ideas, I mean, in one move. Very nice. Okay, well, that didn't happen. After queen d2, Caruana played rook e6. And now white exchanges on e6, but he only excuse me, does so when he can achieve something concrete. And I think that's very important chess theory, that normally you don't exchange or you don't give up the tension if there's nothing concrete in terms of advantage to be gained, right? But in this particular case, Aronian takes. Obviously black has to recapture, and now what he gains is that he can move his pawn forward. And that is important in the sense that now also this bishop is opened up, already eyeing the a pawn. So black now played queen d6 check, king went back to g1, and I guess knight e7, which was possible but not played in the game, knight e7 and rook a5 already starts to illustrate the point. And after a6, to try and save that pawn, queen d3 attacks it once more. And it's quite likely that we get an exchange of the d5 pawn for the a6 pawn, which is really what Aronian wants, because it's easier to fight against the d pawn than it is for black to fight against the a pawn. But after king g1, knight e7 wasn't played, but rook b7 was played instead. And now, again, Aronian does not play the most optimal move. I think the best move here was to play rook c6, just to try and be aggressive, take away as many squares as possible from black, and also start hitting his weakness on f6. But instead he plays the somewhat mysterious queen e1, and that just abandons the d pawn for a moment. But in chess, a moment or a tempo is really all we need. And I do have the feeling that somehow after this inaccuracy, the game is again in the balance, that it's much more a draw than a position with a serious advantage or winning chances for white. Now let's see why I think that's the case. Game continued, knight e7, piling up against the d-pawn, which was abandoned by white. Okay, so white goes in for the long-awaited metamorphosis. He wants to exchange the d-pawn for the a-pawn, and we already see it happening a little bit, right? But now, after knight d5, he really cannot take on a7 immediately. Not with the rook, because then after rook a7, bishop takes a7 and queen a6, all white dreams all of a sudden are shattered due to the double attack on the bishop and the a-pawn. But he can also not really capture on a7 with the bishop, because then after knight f4 there is a very nasty threat of queen c7, making use of the fact that currently white's pieces on the a-file are a bit awkwardly placed. And in this position also black seems to be holding the balance. So, where maybe Aronian was expecting to take the pawn on a7 now, he actually now refrains from doing so. He unfortunately has to be patient, and it seems that his inaccuracy on the 36th move with queen e1, temporarily abandoning the d-pawn, means that he's not getting the most out of the metamorphose. He's not getting the best version. So he has to be patient, and he does that with queen d1, making use of the fact that currently the black knight is awkwardly placed, so he now pins the black pieces. So yeah, black is now more or less forced to defend his knight with rook d7, and only now it is better for white to take on a7. Rook a7 followed, and after bishop a7 I think it's time to take stock again, because this is the metamorphose we were talking about earlier. Okay, so let's see. White still has his extra pawn and the better minor piece. The improvement is that his a-pawn is more advanced and more difficult to stop for the black knight than the d-pawn was. It's simply closer, right? The knight is not a very long-range piece. Still, white's task should have been much more difficult, because black at this precise point in time has a concrete defensive maneuver at his disposal. However, with his last move before the time control, he shies away from it. Either he was scared, or he wasn't sure, or he didn't see it, but much better than what he played in the game was, on the 40th move, queen a3. A double attack on the bishop on a7 and the pawn on a2. And because of this double attack, it really forces queen takes d5, queen takes a7, check, and after king h1 for instance, and queen a3 back again, I think this is a very difficult position for white to win, especially because of the rather drafty white kingside position, which invites many perpetual checks. So I believe it's more a draw than a win for white, and often the pawns are placed in reversed positions, so not on light squares as in this case, but let's say on, let's indicate that in red for the moment, the pawns would be placed here, and then normally white has an easier task controlling the light squares along the diagonal so that there is no perpetual check, and then also trying to escort his free pawn towards the queening square. But in this case, well, it's the other way around. There are now, unfortunately for white, two diagonals. Oh, excuse me, this one is wrong. There are two diagonals along which black would be able to harass white's king. So, after bishop takes a7, with his last move before the time control, Caruana passed up on this opportunity to reach a near drawn position, I think. Instead of queen a3, the double attack, he played, however, pawn to g5. So I guess it was an opportunity for Aronian to stretch his legs, get a drink, take a good look at the position, and play the very natural a4. Now white's advantage is very serious again, and probably just simply winning. Of course, white now seizes the moment to push his trump card. It can now no longer be blockaded on a3. But the following phase is still very difficult. Let's see if we can understand how and why Aronian is making progress. There followed Queen a6, which is a double attack, but fortunately for white, the a pawn is already on a protected square. And after bishop d4, there is already some coordination in white's camp. And what's more important, in this line he gets to keep his dark squared bishop to plug the holes, the dark square holes, in his kingside pawn position, right? So in this case it's not so important that there are two drafty diagonals, because there's blood in the veins, right? The blood is running through the veins, namely the bishop on the dark squares. Play continued with Queen c4, and now another nice multifunctional move from Aronian. He played Queen a1. And another feature of the bishop comes to light, is attacking possibilities. White now also puts pressure on the weakness on f6. So for the moment the black knight cannot move. And apart from that, white is also treating his queen as a rook, namely behind the free pawn. It is now possible to support the free pawn all the way to the queening square. Play continued, Queen c2, and well, there's only one way to win this type of position: push your passed pawn. So white played a5, but black is not throwing in the towel yet. He plays knight f4, and now it gets kind of tricky. The much famed combination of queen and knight come to stir up some trouble, preferably on the squares that the bishop cannot protect, namely the light ones. So white blocks and simultaneously threatens to push his pawn even further. Now, black had many possibilities at his disposal. Let's take a look at the one that he didn't play in the game. Knight d3, for instance, to just keep harassing the bishop. But then bishop e3 would follow, and now if the knight would go back to f4, he would just simply take that knight, and after g takes f4 and a6 he would be winning. So after bishop e3 it would be better to go knight b4 to try and, I don't know, somehow stop the pawn, because now if the pawn moves there would be this double attack. And yeah, I think things are still a bit murky in this position. But after knight b4, queen d4, white, due to his great square control, will certainly win. He's hitting the knight, he's hitting the d7 checking square, he will harass the king, he's also threatening bishop takes g5, so I don't think that there's that the win could slip him anymore. Well, after bishop f2, black did not play knight d3, but he went for knight e2 check, which also keeps white busy, right? Because you have to defend against check. If you cannot, it's called checkmate and you lose the game. Aronian went king h2, knight f4 back again, harassing the bishop. But now, and this is a very nice theme, the queen returns home to aid in the defense of the king side, but also to support the advantage of the pawn from another angle. Now note that the pawn has already advanced enough to be supported from the otherwise poor square on f1. If the pawn were still on a4, apart from being being captured, it would not be supported in moving to a5. But if white can now move it from a5 to a6, it would be on a supported square, right? So, yeah, in this position a funny fighting option would have been knight h3, and regardless of how white now recaptures the knight, he will lose his free pawn. Let's take a look at king h3, for instance. Then this double attack will pick up the pawn, but obviously it's not enough. Also g takes h3, queen c7, king g2, queen takes a5 will lose the pawn, but with his extra bishop and a little bit of technique, Aronian should be able to win this game. So after king f1, the nice returning move, Caruana tried knight d3, again harassing that bishop. Now I think that in this particular situation, the strongest move was bishop g3, shielding the king along this diagonal. And since the white queen is attacking the black knight for the moment on d3, black's queen has actually trouble going after the a-pawn. For instance, queen c4, keeping an eye on the knight but also trying to hold the free pawn. White can now play queen e2 and go for a counterattack. If we continue that line for a few more moves, black can try and defend against queen e7 check, but here comes the bishop. It has it performs multifunctions. Knight e5, for instance, now after the exchange, and bishop c7. This is going to be an easily winning endgame for white. But after knight d3, Aronian did not play bishop g3. Actually, he played bishop d4. But here comes queen d2, and this move still makes life a little bit difficult for white. Right, the knight wants to return to f4, hitting the g2 pawn. Black is also hitting the a pawn, and the bishop on d4 is latently threatened as well. So white just goes back and tries another method. He needs a little bit more patience to win this game. Here comes queen f4 check. It continues for a few more moves. King h1, and again after queen c4, this defensive position of protecting the knight and trying to hold the a pawn. So white again tries supporting from behind with queen a1. And I think the toughest was now queen a6 actually blocking. But I think that after queen d4, white should still win. He's attacking the knight on d3, but more importantly, he's threatening to exchange queens with queen a7, and I'm guessing that's just a technical win. Maybe Caruana just saw that and decided that maybe it's an inferior move, but it will make Aronian's life a little bit more difficult as well. So after queen a1, he tried queen c2, just to try and harass that white king side once again with knight f4. But white now all of a sudden defends against the knight jump to f4 and also threatens both a6, and again we've seen this theme before, bishop takes g5, because the queen is pinning the f pawn along the long diagonal to the king on g7. Well, Caruana now defends his g5 pawn, but hey, Excelsior, here goes the free pawn. Queen a2 was played, hitting the bishop. Queen g1. Once more the queen returns home from duty. She has helped the pawn to cross a6, and now again from this diagonal she can support the pawn to go to a7, but also help the bishop. And here came queen a2, but it's too little, too late by now. Obviously white now played a7, and the last few moves were knight b4, queen d1, economy of forces. One defender of the free pawn on a7 is enough, so the queen should become queen again and do what she does best, namely to attack. And for the moment black tries to hold her, but Aronian ends it once and for all with a very dry move, namely queen d2. The endgame of bishop versus knight would be winning. Let's take a look. For instance, queen takes d2, bishop takes d2, knight b6, just stopping the pawn in time, but after bishop a5, knight a8 and g4, it all becomes clear. The black knight must stay in the corner to guard against the a-pawn, and the black king must stay in the other corner on the king side to defend his pawns, which are all, very unfortunate for him, on dark squares. Therefore, the white king will join the fray decisively. So if we continue that line a little bit more, f5, bishop b3, king g6. Here are some possible moves of how this endgame could go, and it's quite clear that the white king will enter over the light squares, and she will, or he will either go left or right, and just simply win the game. So after queen to d2, proposing a trade of queens, Caruana played queen a1, another Rache Schach, as the Germans would say. But after bishop g1, he decided he had enough and resigned. Now, why did he resign? In this position, white is threatening to take the knight on d5. And actually, if you look at white's queen, you can see that it is not possible for black's queen to defend his knight on d5, because all these squares, and I will now indicate them in red where the black queen could go, here, here and here, are all controlled by white's queen. So if the black knight cannot be protected, then I suppose the poor beast has to move away. But this would allow the white queen access to the 7th and 8th ranks with checks and support the promotion of his a-pawn. For instance, knight f4, play would continue, queen d7 check, and now queen g6 is nice to see. Queen e8 check, king g7 and a8 queens, which is a very simple win, of course. Or after bishop g1, not knight f4, but let's say knight b6, which still protects the d7 square. But now queen d8 would be sufficient, hitting the knight. The knight cannot go into the corner on a8 because it would be captured. And now after the forced queen a7, white can pick up the knight and be up a piece in an easily winning endgame. So that was the end of this game. Despite some inaccuracies from both sides, a deserved victory, I would say, for Aronian, who was putting the pressure on Caruana throughout the game. I hope you've enjoyed this game and learned something from it. This is Waldemar, signing off. See you next time. Bye bye.